Solo Leveling by Chu Gong. Chapter 17 Part 1 Ice Slayer Hunting. Jin Woo! Songi welcomed Jin Woo with tears in her eyes. Captain! They weren't as emotional as Songi, but the faces of the two male hunters lit up, and Jin heaved a big sigh of relief upon seeing him. Jin Woo didn't have time to respond to his teammate's welcome though. Shoo! He placed a finger to his lips. The other four had been about to go in for a hug, but they froze. Jin spoke first. WH what? That damn bastard deserved to be beaten to death. Jin Woo glared at the unconscious Chul. He brought along some uninvited guests. He could sense numerous presences in the forest. There was no time to consider whether Chul had led them here on purpose, because the real problem was over there. Sensing that Jin Woo was aware of their presence, the Ice Slayers deactivated stealth and made themselves known. There were around 20 of them, and with them, Jin Woo's eyes were fixed on a long-haired Ice Slayer riding a horse. That's the dungeon boss. Compared to the Ice Bears, or even the other Slayers around it, the energy the boss emitted was off the charts. If that wasn't the boss, then what else could be? For the first time in a while, Jin Woo felt uneasy. At the same time, the boss had also assessed Jin Woo. So it's true. There is treasure among the human trash. What? The boss was startled by Jin Woo's outburst. You? Do you know our language? Jin Woo was just as floored. How am I able to communicate with it? He understood the magic beast's language. Not only that, but he was able to speak it as well. The language he'd never learned flowed out of him as naturally as his mother tongue. You can speak their language? Jin had been flabbergasted so many times that it was par for the course by now. Her words confirmed that Jin Woo was the only one who understood what the boss had said. Is this because of the system? Was it like an auto-translator? Jin Woo met the boss's gaze as it scrutinized him with interest. We can communicate. Good. There is someone I'd like to introduce you to. The boss pointed at an Ice Slayer standing behind it. I believe you two have met before. Jin Woo's eyes narrowed. The Ice Slayer definitely looked familiar. That bastard is. It was the one who'd shot an arrow at Songi and mocked him. How could he forget that arrogant mug? That Ice Slayer was smiling even now. I said there was a strong one among the humans. This one wishes to challenge you to a bat. Even before the boss finished its sentence, Night Killer was hurtling toward the Ice Slayer. Shunk! The dagger lodged right in the middle of the Ice Slayer's face. Whoa! The squeal came from among the hunters. Kijum quickly covered his mouth. Whump! The Ice Slayer hit the ground. Jin Woo held out his hand, and Night Killer dislodged from the Slayer's face and flew back to him. He caught it in a reverse grip and lowered his stance. Anything else to say? The boss was impressed. You really are strong. It got off the horse, but didn't brandish a weapon or display any hostility. It continued leisurely. But I'm sure you're aware that you wouldn't be able to defeat all of us. There were over 20 Ice Elves, and the boss was among them. The rest of the Ice Slayers were no match for Jin Woo, who had leveled up considerably by killing Ice Bears. One of the Slayers had already died by his dagger. How should I deal with him? As the gears turned in his head, the boss continued. I have a suggestion for you. Suggestion? That's right. It won't be such a bad deal for you. Jin Woo was amazed. It was well known that humanoid magic beasts had intellect, but he never thought he could make a deal with one. Jin Woo decided to hear it out at least. I'm listening. The boss laughed, as if it had expected this reaction. Let me ask you one thing. Why are you allied with these humans, even though you yourself are not one of them. Jin was brow furrowed. What the hell are you talking about? Ha ha! You aren't aware either? The boss burst out laughing and pointed at its temple. We hear a constant voice in our heads that tells us to kill humans. But standing before you, I don't hear that voice. Ah, so that's what it meant? In that case, Jinwoo had a potential explanation. When it talks about humans, it probably means hunters. Since the underground temple, thanks to the system, Jinwoo had become a player. So to be pedantic, he was a little different from other awakened beings called hunters. That's why it thinks I'm not human. That made sense to Jinwoo. As it appeared he understood, the boss nodded. We don't need to fight. I don't want needless casualties on our side. The boss finally got to the point. Just hand over those humans behind you. Then I will guarantee your life. How does that sound? Jinwoo had a question in return. Let me ask you something. Certainly. Who are you? Where are you from? And why are you trying to kill humans? We are. Suddenly, the boss's face, smile and all, froze. It didn't last long. The boss then relaxed its smile and spoke again. We don't need to fight. I don't want needless casualties on our side. What is this? Jinwoo's eyes narrowed. The boss had repeated the same lines. Like some NPC in a game asked a question it was unable to answer. Just hand over those humans behind you. Then I will guarantee your life. How does that sound? Its expression appeared unruffled, the creature apparently unaware that it was acting strange. The Ice Slayers behind the boss were also seemingly oblivious to their boss's sudden odd behavior. Because Jinwoo wasn't saying anything, the boss gave him a nudge. Will you accept my offer? Jinwoo wanted to find out more about the magic beasts, but it was a waste of time. Well then, the only thing left was to make a choice. His mind was already made up. No, Jinwoo smirked. I would love your shadow, so I can't let you go. Kill the boss and take the shadow. That had been Jinwoo's plan from the moment he'd laid eyes on the boss, and he had no intention of changing it now. Are you challenging my soldiers and me? You are outnumbered. Do you think you can do this alone? Jinwoo smiled. Soldiers? You think you're the only one? I have soldiers too. He summoned his shadows. The minions trapped in his shadow appeared behind him in an instant. Ah! The scream again came from Jinwoo's group. The shadowy bears and soldiers had materialized next to Kajung, startling him and making him trip over his feet. Aeon! Jinwoo felt bad for his teammates, whose faces had turned pale. But it was a moment of crisis, after all. There was no time to explain everything. Well, even if there wasn't a crisis, I wouldn't explain anything to them. 29 shadow soldiers. Jinwoo stood before his army and glared at the boss. Who's outnumbered now? Finally, the boss growled. Nice party trick. Fine. If you wish to die, I'll grant you that wish. The boss drew 2 daggers from its waist. This was what Jinwoo had hoped for. Jinwoo summoned Night Killer in his right hand, and Kasaka's Venom Fong in his left. Party trick? The boss did have a point. Even though Jinwoo had more soldiers, they weren't powerful enough to take down the boss. Jinwoo was well aware of this. It was likely the source of the boss's confidence. Jinwoo needed reinforcements. Powerful reinforcements. He did have one. Jinwoo looked to the side where Chol lay unconscious. Attack! The boss yelled, and the Ice Slayers drew their bows. Teddy bears! Jinwoo positioned the shadow beasts up front. Shunk! 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 Gra! Arrows rained down from above, and the shadow beasts who were struck cried out in pain. Before the Ice Slayers could fire off any more arrows, the infantry began their charge, and the mages started to cast their spells. There was a fire in Jinwoo's eyes. "Your ass is mine." Chul's sword had fallen behind Jinwoo's foot, and he kicked the blade toward Chul before he took off. His eyes were fixed on the Ice Slayers' boss, and it was waiting for him. Soon, sparks flew from the 4 daggers wielded by Jinwoo and the boss. Clang! Clang! See a clang! The Shadow Soldiers and Ice Slayers clashed as well. Myungwon looked at Hee-jin. Shouldn't we help?" She shook her head. "There's nothing we can do here." On the battlefield were big black monsters waving their giant claws around, shadowy soldiers that respawned instantaneously, and high-rank Ice Slayers brandishing swords and bows. What good are some B and C-rank hunters here? All they could do was pray. Hee-jin anxiously watched Jinwoo battle the long-haired Ice Slayer. "NGH!" Jinwoo cried out. His opponent was a high-rank dungeon boss. All right. It looked like an even fight. Yet Jinwoo was the only one getting nicked. Could he last 3 more minutes at this point? His MP was quickly depleting because his soldiers had to keep reforming. Eventually, the mages completed their spell. Balls of fire larger than volleyballs dropped on the Ice Slayers. Boom! The power of the leveled-up mages was extraordinary. The explosion was so loud, it roused Chul. "MM!" Chul lifted his head. Clank! Clank! Bang! With his blurred vision, he saw terrifying Ice Slayers and Black Knights locked in battle. What is happening? He didn't know what was going on, but he knew very well why he was lying there. Someone had struck him on the back of his head. That voice he'd heard behind him. It was Jinwoo Sung. Now wide awake, he felt his hands trembling from shame and hatred, but he was able to reach for his sword. There was no way for him to survive, surrounded as he was by Ice Slayers. If that was the case, "I'll take that bastard down with me." His contemptuous eyes scanned the battlefield. And there he was. Jinwoo was fighting an Ice Slayer and paying no mind to what was behind him. This was his chance. Chul stood up quickly and charged Jinwoo. "Rah!" Jinwoo sensed Chul was rushing toward them, and his mood lifted. "If it's you." Jinwoo had predicted this was going to happen. Chul aimed and swung his sword at Jinwoo's neck. "Eat shit!" With the boss in front of him and Chul behind, Jinwoo shouted, "Igris!" Igris rushed out of Jinwoo's shadow and blocked Chul's sword. Clang! What? Chul's bloodshot eyes widened. But before the hunter could say anything, Igris stabbed his sword deep into Chul's chest. Shunk! The sword pierced his chest and shot out his back. Air! Jinwoo quickly withdrew a few steps. I knew this was how you'd react, Chul. Chul was the type of person who let his emotions dictate his actions. Even though they'd interacted only briefly, it had been enough for Jinwoo to figure him out. Chul scowled at Jinwoo. You? Those were his last words, followed by his last breath. While Igris blocked the boss's path, Jinwoo stood over Chul's shadow. Arise! Then, aha! The plaintive cry was followed by a large hand bursting from the shadow. Shadow extraction successful. Nice. Jinwoo was pumped. The last puzzle piece had fallen into place in this boss raid. The Black Knight that spawned from his shadow was much beefier than Chul himself had been. Additionally, he held a huge war hammer in one hand and a shield as tall as a grown man in the other. The shadow exuded an immensely threatening aura. Chul was pretty muscular, but this shadow is. Despite the urgent situation, Jinwoo couldn't help but be impressed. Please choose a name. Write a name. Jinwoo took a peek at the battle still raging. Igris was getting overwhelmed by the boss. He was only meant to buy time for Jinwoo by respawning. SHHHK. The boss lopped off one of Igris's arms. I don't have time for this. Name. It could be anything. Should he just use Chul Kim? Jinwoo shook his head. He didn't feel comfortable naming the undead after a human. Right. Chul Kim Chul in English is iron. That would be his name. Jinwoo had chosen a name for the newly raised Shadow Soldier. Iron LV.1. Knight rank. Knight rank. That was the same rank as Igris, but Jinwoo had no time to be pleased. I gotta get moving. He gestured at the boss. Iron! Iron's large frame lumbered forward. Stomp, stomp, stomp. Jinwoo liked Iron's size, but worried about how he would fare against the boss's speed. His worries didn't last. Iron puffed his chest and let out a battle cry. Rah! What was that? Jinwoo flinched at the unexpected noise as a message appeared. Ping. Iron is using skill. Epic taunt. The master of the dungeon has entered a state of aggro. An aggro skill! Chul was an A-rank tank, so of course he had a high-level aggro skill. And now Iron, who was a shadow, could mimic said skill perfectly. The boss whipped around immediately. Even though it could have ended Igris right then and there, the boss charged Iron as if possessed. Iron used the reinforcement skill to endure the boss's dagger. Yes! Jinwoo nodded in approval. Meanwhile, Igris's severed arm regenerated. Black smoke rose from the stump and solidified into a new arm. The boss continued to focus on Iron. Jinwoo and Igris seized the opportunity to attack the boss together. Jin had no words for the spectacle she was witnessing. It was incredibly surreal. She had no desire to learn more about what was happening. Next to her, Songy timidly spoke up. Jin. The hunter belatedly answered. Yeah. Do all hunters' fights look like this? Songy's voice trembled from fright. Jin sounded defeated. If they did, I wouldn't have been able to get my hunter's license. Myungwon watched dazedly. Maybe we're only dreaming all this? If this were a dream, then it was actually a nightmare. Jin gasped as she watched the shadowy things fight the magic beasts. At the same time, she began to worry about something. Once we get out of here, we'll have to talk to investigators. What were they supposed to tell people? She couldn't even begin to explain what had happened with Jinwoo inside the Red Gate. After she brought this up. But you know, Kijun was still on the ground, shaking in fear, and had trouble getting the words out. Isn't it kind of amazing that we're actually worried about what'll happen after we leave? All the teammates nodded. A high-rank dungeon and a red gate, no less. It was a place they'd never once thought they'd escape alive, but now they were concerned with the aftermath. It was all because of one person. Jin turned her eyes to Jinwoo. Thanks to you, Jinwoo-sung. More than shock or gratitude, she felt awe. SHHHK. Kasaka's venom fang was stuck in the boss's shoulder. Debuff. Paralysis has been activated. Debuff has been cancelled out by the opponent's high resistance level. Debuff. Drain has been activated. Debuff has been cancelled out by the opponent's high resistance level. As the enemy's levels went up, Kasaka's venom fang's debuff failed more times than not, but the injuries it inflicted were still effective. Take that. The boss's movement slowed as its wounds piled up. And then GH. The smile on its face had vanished a long time ago. The boss had been easily dodging the combined attacks of Jinwoo, Igris, and Iron up to now. but it was starting to run out of steam. Don't let up. Iron grabbed the boss in a steely embrace. Now! When Jinwoo gave the signal, Igris and Jinwoo retreated. The boss had a look of confusion on its face. What? The mage soldiers dropped fireballs on Iron's position. Kaboom! Boom! Arg! The boss cried out in pain for the first time. It twisted its body, and Iron's arm fell off. Crack! The boss turned to Jinwoo with murder in its eyes. Bruh! Jinwoo was amazed once again. It's injured that badly, but it keeps on coming. After all, it was the master of a high-ranked dungeon. Unfortunately for it, though, they were way past the tipping point. Dagger throw. Jinwoo hurled Night Killer like he had at the previous Eye Slayer, but he gave it an extra push using Ruler's hand. Whoosh! The dagger cut through the air in an instant. Ugh! Realizing it couldn't avoid the dagger in time, the boss blocked it with its own weapon. KRRK. Because Night Killer had been thrown with such force, the boss's dagger cracked upon impact. At the same time, Jinwoo used stealth and dashed to close the gap and thrust Kasaka's venom fang into the boss's gut. Shunk! The boss's eyes bulged wide in shock. Arg! Yet, even after all this, it grabbed Jinwoo's wrist. It was determined to go down fighting. Rareath! The boss raised its dagger above its head. Jinwoo smirked. An enormous war hammer struck the boss's skull. Blam! Its head slammed into the snow covering the forest floor. Iron lifted both his regenerated arms again and slammed the hammer down once more. Splat. Igris had been readying his next attack, but instead sheathed his sword, and Jinwoo put his daggers into inventory. The expected messages materialized. Ping. You have defeated the master of the dungeon. You have leveled up. You have leveled up. Phew. It's finally over. Jinwoo exhaled in relief. It had been a hard-fought victory. He was just about to catch his breath when Iron caught his attention. Hey! Hey, stop it now! He rushed to halt Iron. The Shadow Warrior had been about to drop his hammer yet again, but stopped. He was as merciless as when he had been Chul. The boss's body had already been obliterated. It's good that doesn't affect the shadow. He smiled. The ultimate reward for the hard battle was right under his feet. Jinwoo murmured, Arise! It was already 3 a.m. The 4 higher-ups monitoring the Red Gate did not look good. Kitchell finally spoke up. We'll stay here. So why don't you leave first, Mr. President? How could I go home while our guild members are stuck in there? President Yunho Beck was firm. He couldn't leave them upon his honor as an active guild master and S-rank hunter. Suddenly, Songmin's eyes widened. Huh? The Red Gate. Kitchell and Sunchan also noticed that something odd was happening. The Red Gate is opening. The dungeon's been cleared. People are coming out. President Beck clenched his fist tightly. Chul Kim, is this his handiwork? VMM. Everyone rushed up to the gate. Beck couldn't hide his excitement and looked for Chul, the leader, but he wasn't among those who emerged from the portal. Huh? What? That's odd. Sunchan had also placed his confidence in Chul, and his expression grew stranger with every second. Hunter Park, Hunter Ko and Hunter Yoon, Hunter Sung. A big smile crossed Sungmin's face as he spotted Jinwoo with Songi trailing the 3 white tiger hunters. I knew it. His smile was a sharp contrast to the stony look on Sunchan's face. But the smile quickly vanished. The gate disappeared after only 5 hunters, including Jinwoo, stepped through. Kitchell asked, Did only the 5 of you make it? Jin Woo looked tired as he nodded affirmatively. Kitchell was devastated. How could this be? He had tears in his eyes as he crossed out the names of the dead on his list. Beck, who was watching this all happen, let out a cry. Only the low-rank hunters survived? Only a single B rank came back? This was impossible. What had happened inside the gate? Let's go! I'll take you home. Jin Woo was about to leave with Songy when the president grabbed his wrist. Wait a second, sir! Smack! Jin Woo snatched his arm back. Beck's gaze sharpened. Let's talk for a second. Jin Woo turned around. I'm tired now. If you have any questions, please ask your guild members. Beck couldn't stand it anymore and finally revealed his identity. I'm Yunho Beck, the guild master of the White Tiger Guild. Jin Woo's eyes remained cold. And? Jin Woo's frosty reception caused Beck's eyes to transform into those of a magic beast. They looked completely feral. We lost 9 of our guild members from this incident. Don't I have a right to ask you a few questions as the president of the guild? This wasn't a request. It was an order, or perhaps a threat. Whatever one wanted to call it, Beck had no intention of letting Jin Woo go just like that. But Jin Woo looked pissed. He didn't cower at the immense pressure exuding from S-rank hunter Yunho Beck. I say 3 of your people. As the president, shouldn't you start by thanking me? The tables had turned, and it was Beck who now felt the weight of Jin Woo's anger. Everything Jin Woo said was right, after all. He couldn't argue with that. I apologize. Yunho gave a repentant bow. Jin Woo turned to leave. Let's go, Songy. Okay. Songy peeked at Jin Woo's expression as she followed him, so as to not irritate him more. Eventually, they got in the van and left. This doesn't make sense. Yunho's thoughts were all jumbled. He sprinted over to Heejin, the only surviving high-rank hunter. Excuse me, Heejin. She was warming up with some tea Kitchell had brought her. What's with that guy? Why is he in such a bad mood? They had escaped from a red gate after overcoming untold hardship, so why was he acting so savage? Heejin shook her head, indicating she had no idea. I don't know, sir. After he defeated the boss, he muttered something 3 times while he stood in front of the corpse. He's been acting that way ever since. So he was fine until then? She looked at Myungwon and Kijung. They simultaneously nodded. What a strange man he is. Yunho mumbled to himself as he looked at the alley Jin Woo had driven down. Sangin started wringing his hands like it was all his fault. I'm sorry, Mr. President. He was probably exhausted. He isn't a bad person, from what I've seen. No, that's not the problem. Pardon me? Yunho looked sternly at Sangin. Why haven't you recruited him yet? Sir? Sangin couldn't hide that he was flustered, but what he felt couldn't compare to Yunho's vexation. Against me. The president swallowed hard as he recalled Jinwoo's cold eyes. Gulp. A thought occurred to him that he would be resigned to losing at least one arm in a fight against Jin Woo. Possibly more than just an arm. Realizing what Yunho meant, Sangin replied hastily. I'm doing my best, sir. Well, it's not good enough. Yunho's eyes shined. Jin Woo sung. Clearly, Mandarin had picked another winner. Use whatever resources you need. Make him a part of our guild at any cost. On the way home, vroom, a bitter taste filled Jinwoo's mouth. Ha. Unfortunately, he had failed to extract the Ice Slayer boss's shadow. Was it because the difference between his and the boss's abilities was too great? It sucks, but there's nothing I can do. There would be plenty of high-rank bosses. What was important now was increasing his abilities, so he wouldn't miss out on another opportunity like that again. Leveling up. That was what Jinwoo did best. Also, he took his left hand off the wheel for a second, and a beautifully curved dagger appeared. Item: Barca's dagger. Acquisition difficulty: A. Category: Dagger. A dagger used by the great warrior Barca. A powerful spell of weightlessness imbued in the dagger allows the user to be more agile while wielding it. Attack power plus 110. Agility plus 10. At least, he hadn't walked away completely empty-handed. This was one of the 2 daggers the boss had used. He disposed of the damaged dagger and kept this one. Barca's dagger. It not only packed a powerful attack, but also boosted agility. It was a superior dagger compared to both the C-rank Kasaka's Venom Fang and the B-rank Night Killer, which he'd spent so much money on. The acquisition difficulty was a rank as well. It was the ideal weapon to replace Kasaka's Venom Fang, which was proving less and less effective as of late. It even feels good in my hand. Jinwoo was recounting the events of the Red Gate as they pulled up to Songy's apartment building. Screech. Songy, who had sat so quietly that it was like she wasn't even there, got out of the front passenger seat and bowed. "Have a safe drive." "Right." She turned around, looking at the way her shoulders slumped and how she was trudging to the door. Jinwoo felt he had achieved his goal. Things got complicated, but it was all about convincing Songy. She appeared to no longer want to be a hunter. It would be the same for anyone whose first dungeon experience involved a red gate. Jinwoo was satisfied with himself and was about to start the van when the passenger side door suddenly opened. Jinwoo looked over. Songy had returned and was holding open the door. "What's she doing?" He didn't have to wait long. She politely bowed once again. "Thank you for everything, Jinwoo." Sometime while in the Red Gate, she'd stopped calling him Mister. "Yeah, sure. See you tomorrow." "Well, in a few hours." "A few hours." He eventually realized what Songy meant after she was out of sight. Starting today, Jinwoo had to finish the rest of the raids with Jinho. He was going to see her again because she was a member of the squad. That's what she was talking about. He was relieved. Had Songy refused to leave home because of this incident, it would have seriously messed up his schedule. This turned out well. Now Jinwoo could clear C-rank dungeons even faster using his shadow soldiers. He was confident he'd complete the rest of the raids in record time. Besides, he was looking forward to seeing Jinho's reaction when faced with the shadow soldiers for the first time. It can't be Kajung's reaction though. Jinwoo chuckled as he slowly turned the corner. The following morning. Yawn on. Jinwoo was still sleepy as he made his way to the lobby of his apartment building. It felt like he'd blinked and it was already time to work. "Good morning, boss." Jinho gave an enthusiastic greeting. "How did you get here without your van?" Jinwoo had used the team's trusty van yesterday, so it was parked in a lot nearby. "I took a taxi, boss." I see." So much for his plans to be the one to pick Jinho up. "That's okay, boss. You're already doing plenty for me, so I should at least be the one driving," Jinho replied with a laugh. It was a typical morning except... Jinho noticed the cylindrical object in Jinwoo's hand. It piqued his curiosity. "What's that, boss?" "Oh, this." Jinwoo grinned mischievously. "Something I'll need in the dungeon today." "Huh?" At that moment, Jinho felt a chill run up his spine. Is that a weapon he'll use in the dungeon? Jinwoo was already overpowered, so what frightening new weapon was this? Jinho felt anxious. Gulp. He took a breath to calm down and nodded. Okay, boss, let's go. Hold on. Jin-woo pulled out his phone and made a call. We need to pick someone up. What? Who? Hey, Sony. Meet us downstairs. We'll give you a ride. Sony. Was that? As soon as Jin-woo hung up the phone, Jin-ho pounced. Are we picking up that high school girl in our squad? Jin-woo nodded in confirmation. Sony's apartment was on their way, so he figured they might as well pick her up. But Jin-ho read more into it. Sony Han. She was the cute high schooler who always wore her hair in a bun. He knows her phone number and was all friendly with her. Are they already that close? Jin-woo was impressive even from a guy's point of view. Especially when he only uses a dagger to take on a monster, he really is. The boss might not be interested in her, but it wouldn't be surprising to discover that she was crushing on Jin-woo. Jin-ho nodded. He was determined to get verification. So, boss, should I refer to Sony as ma'am from now on? Did he eat something weird during breakfast? Jin-woo's reaction was asking as much. Though usually clueless, Jin-ho understood the hunter's expression this time. So you two aren't dating? She's just my sister's friend. Oh. That explained it. Jin-ho finally grasped the reality of the situation. And to think he'd been about to call her ma'am. He was so embarrassed. Eventually, Sony emerged, more dressed up than usual. Jin-ho grinned. Okay, so she's a teenage girl with a crush on her friend's older brother. As squad leader, he thought he should compliment her nice outfit, but Jin-woo greeted her first. Did you get any sleep? Jin-ho froze. Sony smiled as she shook her head. Not at all. Take a nap in the van. You must be tired. Jin-ho couldn't follow their conversation. Huh? It was Sony's turn to ask in return. What about you, Jin-woo? I just took a light nap. It was past 4 by the time I got home. I see. Night? Not a wink. Tired? Past 4 by the time he got home? Jin-ho was freaking out by now. Jin-woo had started heading to the van, but stopped to look back at Jin-ho. Jin-ho, let's go! Boss? Sony is a minor, boss. Yeah, and? Nothing, boss. What a man among men. Jin-ho was amazed that Jin-woo refused to be shackled by society's rules. He really isn't an average guy, that's for sure. Jin-ho reflected on himself forever measuring Jin-woo against typical societal standards.